We move to Dr. Kari Odermann, who is in Cairo now, to talk about this draft and how this draft was leaked in the first place, some of the conditions and limitations of this draft to end the war in Ukraine. Now, the draft calls for de facto recognition, like I was saying, of Crimea, Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia as Russia. How can a peace framework claim to uphold Ukraine's sovereignty while also legitimizing annexation and violate its constitution?
We've got a lot of inconsistencies with this document. First of all, the 28 points were leaked beforehand. The language is strikingly different than proposals in the past that indicate that different people have their hand in this negotiation. It's probably really important to point out that someone named Kirill Dmitriev, who is in charge of finances in Russia, not in charge of foreign policy, has played a very prominent role in this 28-point plan. It's actually rumored that he's the one that leaked the plan in advance. And there's been no evidence that the leaked plan is any different than what was presented to Ukraine. And it is a rarity in history and international law that a country would be expected to hand over land that it is currently in control of, which this new peace plan does have. There is also a special rule set up for an area of the Donbass, seeking it to be neutral. But as I was talking about this incongruity, there are sometimes very legal terms, like you had mentioned, de facto, which is basically allowing Ukraine to save face to an extent, saying that it is, in fact, practically Russian, but it does not have to be considered Russian legally. And within the same 28 points, however, it's asking that parts of the country are given away legally, which would be at the same time against Ukraine's constitution. So this peace plan has very little respect for Ukraine's sovereignty. And to be quite frank, this is more about the United States trying to manage Russia's stability than finding a just peace for Ukraine.
Interesting to find out that, who leaked all of this. But just away from that, now let's talk about the army aspect of this. Ukraine's armed forces are currently estimated about 600,000. What concrete security, implications does a 600,000 person cap have for Ukraine's deterrence posture, and how does that align with the promise of robust security guarantees? And just for correction, Ukraine's is 880,000, and while they're capping 600,000. So how does that work?
Now, we're in dangerous territory here because I'm going to try to use a sports analogy to explain this, right? That's a 30% cut in troops. That's like asking a boxer to box in 2 weight classes above what they weigh with one arm tied behind their back and having a referee that is only obligated to make sure the heavyweight, in this case Russia, is treated fairly. Now, you'd ask yourself, how is the United States even going to get Ukraine into the ring in this situation? And they do have some leverage points. They've already threatened to stop sharing intelligence with Ukraine. They could cut any type of aid, and they could also try to influence the international community to stop supporting Ukraine. So there is a way to force Ukraine into the corner here, but cutting the military by 30% and not being specific about security guarantees, which is odd, which goes back again to an incongruity in this peace plan, because some things from the Russian perspective are very specific, and other things that are supposed to offer Ukraine some type of security are very vague.
Now, the plan also demands a constitutional amendment barring NATO membership and a NATO pledge never to admit Ukraine. How does this reconcile with the alliance's open door policy and the principle of collective defense? Now, like I said, we're taking all of the 28 points into, the questions that I'm asking. So let's talk about the NATO membership for a bit.
Everyone talks about NATO Article 5, which is if one person, because I call it the Three Musketeers, all for one, one for all. But it's actually NATO Article 10, which has this open door policy, which is what should be looked at here. And this is basically giving Russia a veto to who can become a NATO member. What's next? Are you and I going to have a veto about who can become a NATO member? This simply is very creative wording. This is aspirational. It's non-binding. that Russia has no say in who becomes a NATO member or not.
Now, $100 billion of frozen Russian funds would be funneled into a United States-led reconstruction effort, with the United States taking 50% of the profits. Now, what are the legal and diplomatic ramifications of turning seized foreign assets into a profit-sharing venture, especially for the European partners who also hold frozen funds?
Well, most of these funds are held by Euroclear and Belgium, and they haven't been touched yet because of such a conservative approach about releasing them. They are not in the United States. I don't know how the United States thinks they're going to get this, and I'll be watching this with a great deal of interest. There's not only legal ramifications, but there's moral ramifications for this. The United States is turning a peace plan for Ukraine into a profit-sharing deal, which makes sense if you look at the transactional nature of Donald Trump's diplomacy, and perhaps it could have been predictable. But again, there are no official ways that the United States or the Trump administration can really force the hand of the Europeans or even people at the bank to do this.
So the draft also promises reliable security guarantees. Let's go to security now. But that also offers no detail on who provides them or how they would be triggered. What mechanisms, would make these guarantees credible, and why are they left vague?
They're left very vague because right now, Russia is using these negotiations, in my opinion, to buy time again. They've started selling their gold reserves, and that means they're running out of cash. The war that Russia is fighting in Ukraine costs between 800 million and 1 billion a day. And by selling the last of their gold reserves, it's showing what dire economic situation they're in. However, they're being very, very bold in this negotiation, making a lot of demands. For security guarantees to work, there has to be very specific definitions of what is considered a security guarantee and exactly what will happen when these things are triggered. And now in today's world of hybrid warfare, shadow war, it is very difficult then to expand that definition. It is not normal for negotiations to be put on fast forward like this. It is a sign that the United States is actually helping to stabilize Russia, because as they run out of money, there may be an imminent collapse of that country. And I think that's a larger fear for the United States than anything else.
I'm going to ask you a question that I've asked, the moment when it seemed like why Trump was favoring Putin more than, Zelensky. And that's the question on everyone's mind. A lot of people said, what's Putin? What does he have on, Trump? And then a lot of people, what does Russia has on the United States? I mean, this far beyond all this conversation we're having, we wonder why, they're treated with a kid's glove while Zelensky isn't. Plus, just that to finally wrap things up, I want you to answer that with the European officials saying they haven't even seen the draft. How does the lack of EU involvement affect the plan's legitimacy, and what are the likely diplomatic fallout points for transatlantic, relations?
Well, let's start at the back end of that first. Any plan that doesn't include Europe is a unilateral plan from the United States, and that's going to be very hard to be enforced. Recently, I was in discussions in Poland, and they are very clear on being the next front line if negotiations don't go well. It's very important that Europeans have representatives there. We talk a lot about Putin's red lines and his threats of nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction. But what we're dealing with here is weapons of mass distraction. And unfortunately, Ukraine might be victim to Donald Trump trying to distract from other issues domestically. What exactly those are, I don't know. But we have to keep in mind that the relationship between Donald Trump going back to 2019 and President Zelensky started out very rocky. And it was one of the reasons, his quid pro quo, for the first impeachment hearing for Trump. There is no love lost between these two men. And it's important to point out that if this forced peace agreement comes into fruition, people may argue that Ukraine is at peace, martial law is over, and Zelensky might no longer be president because elections could take place. This is something that many conservative Americans and also Vladimir Putin has been pushing for. Now, why President Trump seems to have a better relationship with someone that's accused of war crimes, that's hard to say. But the Kremlin has a long history of collecting information on people, compromat, that can be used. And a lot of the things that are happening right now in US politics seem to have a connection to reflexive control. And that's a type of psychological warfare where situations are set up and Donald Trump isn't forced to act in any way, but the situation is set so he is more than likely to react in a certain way. And we're seeing that right now with him pushing for a pre-Thanksgiving solution, almost like he wants to present his domestic audience a peace plan, like a turkey.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Kari Odermann, for joining us to talk about our top stories today.